Hi everyone and welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today we're going to be painting Huron Blackheart in the traditional Red Corsairs red scheme. I'm also painting this little Fleshhound doggy buddy and obviously all the green glow and stuff I'll show you how to do. First of all, I've built the main model all together and I've just kept the little doggo separately just to make it easier to get to him. I've glued them all down. I've added some skulls to the front of the base. I'm actually going to be moving where the dog is. I'm going to put the dog over to just below his axe and not over to his leg side, just so it adds a little bit more just to that right side as you're looking at it of the model. So I based the model in Vallejo black primer with an airbrush, and now using an airbrush again, as you can see I'm just using a sort of cheap £30 airbrush. Put some Vallejo White Ink directly in there, and what we're doing is we're going to do some volumetric highlighting using white ink so that we can spray straight over the top of that and get a nice bright red finish. So what I'm doing here, I'm just spraying in the areas where the red armour will be and focusing where I want it to be brighter, to have the most white ink, and then to have a natural gradient down back into that black where we want it to be darker. And the ink that we're going to be using when we do the red armour will help tinge that blackness into a dark red. So all you need to do here, I'm not using any thinner or anything with the white ink, it's straight out of the pot. It's just you sometimes have to clear the needle where the ink dries just on the end of the needle, because the air flowing through it tends to dry the ink out, so you need to pull that off occasionally. Now the white ink is really bright and it's sort of over highlights on the camera, so it's only just a couple of sprays as you can see there. It's not a lot, a couple of quick sprays and moving along. If you spray too much you'll get spider webbing and it'll create all kinds of mess, and if that happens then you need to just go back over with black primer to just sort of clear that up. But all I'm doing here is I'm just adding a couple of sprays to the areas where I want to be red to be brightest, and leaving those natural halo gradients where I want it to be darker. For the red armour, I'm going to make a little mix. So first of all, I'm going to put a few drops of Vallejo Red Ink into the airbrush, and then I'm going to put one drop of Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red. And what it does is it just creates a slightly brighter red, adds a little bit of a difference, because red ink gets straight out can be quite dark, which you can go for if that's what you wanted, but I just wanted to have a slightly brighter red on Huron. So yeah, you just add those into your airbrush. I'd say it's probably about 3 to 1, so 3 drops of red ink to 1 drop of fluorescent red. give it a mix up in the airbrush. We can mix it up into a separate pot and pour it in, and then just very carefully spray it over the model, the areas that you've just done all this armor, to make sure you cover not only the panels but obviously the darkness that's next to them if you've done the volumetric highlighting or zenithal highlighting. Take care, like with the white ink, this is very wet, so you only need a few sprays and then move on to the next area. When you see that paint glisten, that means it's wet on the model and you need to move away, otherwise it will start to pool and run and spider web, and it looks terrible when it does that. So just take care, very slowly, airbrush not too close, and just painting in all of the red. Once that stage is done, I then go back and just paint all of the areas that aren't the armor to bring them back to a standard black base. For this, I'm just using a new color that I got from Ionic, which is cold black. I usually use AK Tenebrous Grey, or sometimes the Army Painters matte black, but I wanted to just try a different paint, see what these Ionic paints are like, because they've got getting some good reviews online. So I've just this coal black is a bit like Corvus black or AK Tenebrous Grey, where they're black but they've got a hint of grey to it, a little hint of purple, a little sometimes it's just a different type of black that gives it a good base coat. So just go around and paint the model in that. You could use a Baden black if you wanted to, or as I said, or Corvus black. Now with his armour, it looks like what GW have done is painted it in black and then just done edge highlights to cover it in silver. So I'm using AK gunmetal, which is a nice dark bluish metal, but lead boucher or iron breaker, any silver that you want. It's not too bright, it's a standard metallic colour. And all I'm doing here is just edge highlighting all of the armour where I want it to be silver, which is pretty much all of it. There's only a few bits of gold on this. It's almost in some places it's a little bit like doing a dry brush, but just very controlled with a smaller brush. This is a slightly older brush that I'm using, so I don't mind if it gets a bit beaten up with some dry brushing. But if you are doing that method and this edge highlight method, just be mindful that the paint will dry out quite quickly on the brush, and it's quite hot in it as well. So I just have to wash the brush out a few times, even add a little bit of water into the metallic paint just to thin it down a little. All I do in here is anything that you want to be silver metal, just go around, edge highlight it, or fill it all out if you wish to. If you decide to paint the whole area, then just go over it with some Nuln Oil just to get that some nice shades and shadows. So that's the silvers done. Next we're going to be moving on to the golds, and we're going to be using 2 golds and also a couple of washes as well. I wanted a sort of dark, dirty look to the golds. I didn't want them to be too bright. I never generally do on my chaos stuff. I like it to be quite dirty. So what we're going to do first is we're going to do a sort of dry brushing of AK Rusty Gold, which would sort of be a Balthazar Gold maybe from Games Workshop. But anything you want to be golden, this is my darkest gold colour. So I just sort of wet dry brushing at the top here just to get a good coverage over the fist that's on the top and the spiky halo that's there, and then there's the halo around his head. His shoulder pads I also paint in gold, and the Eye of Horus Chaos symbol on his belt, that's also painted. There's a few little bits of iconography around as well that I paint gold. But this is where doing a different sort of colour as a base coat. So as I said, I've used the Ionic coal black. If you've used Tenebrous Grey or any colour that's really, really dark, but not just your standard black, gives the colours you're putting over the top, especially when you dry brush, a different finish. The shadow colour is subtly different to just flat black, and it may be hard to see on the camera, but when you are eyes on the model, you can see a difference. So once all the gold is base coated, I'm now going to apply 2 washes. Now you could, if you want to, just use Royco and Flesh Shade and maybe do a couple of washes with it. But I'm going to be doing 2 here. First of all, I'm using AK Beast Brown just to do a wash over the gold areas, focusing in on some of those darker shadowy areas. Then after that, I use a darker brown, which is AK Afro Shadow, and again make a wash out of that. So which is, when I say make a wash, that's going to be 1 drop of paint to maybe up to 10 drops of water to really thin it down like you're making a shade paint from GW. So I can do it on the wet palette by putting a little drop on it and then adding brushfuls of water into it. And then I just work the Beast Brown all over the model, and then the Afro Shadow, which is a bit like Rhinox Hide, again is watered down and then focused in on the areas around the rivets, any dark shadow areas. What it's actually going to do is it's going to tone down the gold, almost make it slightly matte, but add some darkness in the shadows, which is what I wanted to go for. As I said, you could just use Royco and Flesh Shade or Agrax Earth Shade, and put a couple of coats over it, focusing on the areas you want to be extra dark. But I like to use different colours just to add a little bit more flavour and contrast to the models. Once those washes are dry, about 10-15 minutes, it's only about 5 minutes in this office at the moment, it's very warm. I then use some AK Old Gold, which would be sort of Retributor armour from Games Workshop. And now what I do is I'm just highlighting the areas that I want to be bright that would have caught the light. So simple little edge highlights and a few scratches and scrapes. Just picking out the areas I want to be bright on the tops of the armour, around that sort of circle sphere-y thing that's on his, holding that bit of fur up. Edge highlighting around any of the halos that he's got in any of the spikes. And then I do a little mix a bit later on of that gunmetal and the gold to create a sort of desaturated gold, and just do a couple of little final spot highlights with that, just to show a little bit of wear and tear on the metal. Right, for the face, I'm going to be using some Cadian Fleshtone. What I've just gone and done is I've just painted the metallic areas with that gunmetal. And now what I'm doing is I'm picking out anything that's the skin with the Cadian Fleshtone. I've not started with like Bugman's flesh or anything like that. I wanted the skin to be quite light. So Cadian Fleshtone's a nice sort of mid-tone to start with. And I just apply a couple of coats of this. So for the flesh wash, I make a wash of AK Wine Red, so 1 drop of paint up to 10 drops of water. You could use Reichel Flesh Shade, perhaps with a little bit of Doomfire Magenta or Vulpes Pink mixed into it, but just again heavily watered down. But a nice purplish pinky red wash helps put a bit more realism in than just your standard brown type flesh washes. And I just put a coat of this over the skin and then put a little bit more onto the sort of areas around his eyes and his mouth and the nose where those creases are, just to show some definition. So once it's dry, I then reapply some Cadian Fleshtone to the raised areas and some flat areas. There's lots of folds and creases and wrinkles on Huron, so I just use what they've sculpted as a guide as to where to put the highlights. I then do a 50-50 mix of Cadian Fleshtone and Kislev Flesh to just apply some more smaller highlights on his face, and then using sorry, that was Cadian Fleshtone and Flayed One Flesh. I then just do small highlights with pure Flayed One Flesh on those very big raised areas. Just to finish off, instead of using pure white, I just use some AK Deck Tan, which is really, really pale colour, just to pick out his teeth. Again, they're very well sculpted on the model and don't take much to pick out. Right, we're now going to do some glowing effects after we've done the face, and that's going to be the lens on his eyepiece, the little vents on the front, the vents on the back. For this we're going to use a few colours. We can use wine red, AK blood red, some AK intense white, some green stuff world fluorescent orange, and then some green stuff world fluorescent red, and then some AK fluorescent orange. But the first thing we're doing is to get the coldness of our glowing effects. We're going to be using wine red. So the vent on the front, I just paint that directly into the 3 slots. And for his eyepiece, I paint the entirety of the eyepiece, including the little frame, so the lens and the frame. And then the vents on the back, I just paint the entirety of the vent on the back. And then I also paint the little Horus's eye on the chaos symbol on his belt, and I just paint the entirety of the eye and a little bit of the surrounding area. So the thing with glowing effects is cold is dark paint, bright and hot for the if you want it hot, it's bright paint. So cold is dark, hot is bright. So to achieve that for these glowing effects, the wine red is the cold part, the afterglow, moving all the way up to fluorescent orange, which is the really bright part. And it's just remembering to make the hot part smaller and smaller so that you leave the afterglow showing. So you don't want to just have it all bright, otherwise it's not bright, and you don't want it all dark, otherwise it's too dark. So after we've done the wine red, I then apply the blood red, or you can use Evil Sun Scarlet. So you could use corn red and then Evil Sun Scarlet, but wine red and blood red from AK work well for me. So I just apply little bits of the blood red into the vents towards the bottom. I paint the lens, the blood red, the eye itself blood red, and the small parts of the vents on this backpack in blood red as well. And then what I do is I grab the AK Intense White, and even smaller now, I paint the little dot in the lens itself, a couple of dots at the bottom of the vent on the front, and a little line for the eye of the Horus symbol, and then some dots in the bottom of the back vents. To get the glowing effect, with the Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red, I apply that all over the areas we've just painted. So it's going from the wine red down to the white, paint the whole thing, and then to make it really pop, get some AK Fluorescent Orange and only apply little dots of that over the top of the white areas that have just been covered with the fluorescent red, so that you've got a nice deep glow with some afterglow of the wine red. Okay, so next we're going to be painting the skulls. So I'm going to start off by base coating them with AK Grim Brown, and this would be like Rhinox Hide from the Citadel range. So yeah, just paint all of the skulls with the Grim Brown, and just making sure to leave the inside of the sockets, that original black that we had, and if there's any sort of nostril bits, anything that's really deep, just leave in the very dark black. So for the skulls, I'm looking for a sort of dark, dusty look, not going to go too bright on the highlights. So the next colour we're going to use is AK Leather Brown, and I'm covering probably 90% of what I've just done with this Leather Brown. Again, leaving that Grim Brown in the darkest, deepest recesses. Then after that, we'll be moving to AK Mud Brown, and again, all I'm really going to do there is add some highlights. I'm just going to be sort of edge highlighting around the eyes, and any dents, I'm going to be picking out those with the mud brown. And then finally we're going to be using AK Light Earth, and that is just a very, very small edge highlight, picking out any of the edges around any of the scratches, the sort of holes that are there, and a few little scratch marks here and there on the back of the skulls, just to fill in some of those flatter areas. You could be dry brushing these, you can be using colours like Rhinox Hide, Steel Legion Drab, Sandry Dust, Ushabti Bone from the Citadel range, but the Grim Brown, Leather Brown, Mud Brown, Light Earth from AK, just a good colours. They give a nice dusty, dirty finish, and they're colours that can be used across multiple different things like leather and grounds and things like that. So they're not colours just for skulls, they can be used for lots of different other things on your models. And then we just add in a few more little lines to those skulls, just to add a little bit of texture to them. Next up, we're going to be doing the leathers. So we've got a little sort of leather bit on the front and on the wrappings of his axe. And for those, we're just going to be base coating them again in the AK Grim Brown, leaving a little bit of that original black undercoat, just in the very deepest recesses, but we're covering probably 98%. We then, once we've done it all in Grim Brown, we're then just going to build up the highlights by using AK Leather Brown again, probably about 80%, and then quite a thick highlight, adding some texture and detail with Saddle Brown, and then a final edge highlight with Cadian Fleshtone, just taking care around the hilt, just to pick out the sort of where they've sculpted it on the axe, on the wraps, just picking out lighter and lighter the edges of the wrappings. So once we've done this, I'm just going to be moving on now to the sort of fur of his little cape. And for this, I've base coated it in the AK Green Brown again. Then I'm going to be using two colours. I'm going to use AK Beast Brown, and this is almost a dry brushing, but quite a thick sort of dry brush, picking out all of the fur in the Beast Brown. And then I also use AK Sahara Yellow, and I make about a 50-50 mix of Beast Brown and Sahara Yellow, and then dry brush that over the top of the pure Beast Brown that we're doing here. And then I add a little bit more Sahara Yellow, probably so it's about a 70-30 mix in favour of Sahara Yellow, and just apply that dry brush over the sort of more raised areas over his shoulder where the leather's more pointing up to the light. You could then go a little bit more to pure Sahara Yellow, but I just wanted again to keep this muted so that the armour and the glowing effects are our brightest points. So yeah, just dry brushing with Beast Brown and then a mix of Beast Brown and Sahara Yellow, getting brighter till you reach a point you're happy with. Again, not too bright so that we detract from the glowing effects, but enough that you give the sort of shape its definition. But this fur is really well sculpted, so it's very easy to dry brush, just take care of the sort of surrounding area. So for his the main material of the cloak, going back to that Ionic black, the Ionic coal black colour, or Corvus black, and I'm just adding white to it. So I've got about a 70-30 mix of black to white. Then I apply that to the cape, and then I get to about a 50-50 mix of black to white, just over some of the highlight areas and edge highlighting. Here I'm just, the paint is very wet, just so that I can get a blend from the dark to the bright, But on the other side of the cloak, I don't really apply too much of a highlight. I just do edge highlighting and some scratches and around the holes and the bottom of the cape. Not too much, you know. With a black, it's hard to highlight black all the time. That's why I've gone for this sort of dark, washed out grey black. So the edge highlighting and that give it a bit more definition. And the Ionic Coal Black and the AK Intense White give it quite a matte finish. They're not very glossy paints. They're very matte, so you get a nice sort of flat finish with them. If you have got a shiny finish, you can just apply some matte varnish over the top of whatever colours you're using, but it's quite basic here. We're not doing too much. The main thing here is to have thin edge highlights and applying some scratches and marks around the rest of the cloak. But as you can see, I've not gone very dark. I'm on that sort of very sort of 70-30 mix, leaving just a little bit of the darkness in the shadows, the folds of the cloak. I then apply that sort of highlight colour we've got, that black to white mix, sort of a dark grey, just across the pipes, and anything that you had black, just apply this as like a small edge highlight to those areas. Okay, we're getting there with Huron. So we're going to be painting the glass vials now. There's 3 of them. 2 I'm doing pink, 1 I'm doing green. So for the pink ones, I add a little drop of water into some AK Magenta, and I'm pushing the paint downwards so that from the top there, wherever you leave your brush, that's where the most paint's going to be left. So with a little bit of a wet mix, I'm just applying the paint very, very carefully so that it pulls to the bottom, which means that you get a low opacity to a high opacity for the one on the right. For this one on the left, I paint the whole area, but really focusing on where I want the glow to be, which is in the bottom bulby part of the vial, and a little dot in the top. So for both of these vials, the main glow is going to be coming from the bottom, with just a little dot at the top to show that there's some reflection there. And the same principles with the green vial. With that I'm using AK Deep Green, or you could use Citadel Moot Green. And again, a little bit of water in it, and just pull that paint downwards so that the paint pulls to the bottom, so you get darker to brighter without having to worry about glazing and all of that. We're just doing a very simple glazing act here, with just a little drop of water and a few layers of paint. And as those layers build up, you get more and more intensity of colour, so you're almost getting a glowing effect just by using those 2. We then jump up to AK Intense Pink and AK Pistachio Green. So the AK Intense Pink, all I do here is add where I want the water or whatever liquids in there to have been pulled. I add quite a few area of that towards the bottom, and a little dot in the top where I want the highlight to be. And the same with the vial, a little dot there, and then an area at the bottom where it's pulled in. Not just a straight flat area there, just little dots and scrapes with the brush, just to show that the water could be moving around. And then again with that deep green, the pistachio green, same principle, dot in the top, and then a dot and an area to paint at the bottom where I want that liquid to be settling. Then with the white, as you know, which is the basis for our fluorescent colours, I just, in a smaller area than was covered with our last colours, just a couple of dots where you want it to be really, really bright. So a couple of dots at the bottom and a dot at the top. And then for our fluorescent paints, we're going to be using AK Fluorescent Green, which we just paint over the areas we've just painted. And then we use Green Stuff World Fluorescent Rose for the pink glowing effect. As you can see here, my fluorescent green is clogged up. You find this sometimes with fluorescent paints, but I've got an old airbrush needle which you can put into some of these AK pots. So yeah, the green we just paint over the white and a little bit of the surrounding area, and the same with the Green Stuff World Fluorescent Rose over our intense pink, and a little bit over the magenta and white, just so it covers and gives a nice glowing effect. I then decide I want him to have a green glowing eye, and I want the skulls to be glowing green eyes as well. So using deep green, I just paint the eye and the surrounding area, and the skulls I just paint internally, those inside the sockets, with the deep green, and there's a hole in the head of one of them. Then the same principles with a white. I had a little dot on his eye for white, and a couple of little dots in each of the eyes of the skulls. Then I just paint over that with the fluorescent green to get a green glowing eye effect on the skulls and Huron himself. So now we're moving on to some of the final parts of the model. Main parts can be our glowing green effects coming from his power claw and the axe. So the first step of this is I apply pure AK Intense White into the sort of that circle part that's on his power fist. I then just do some edge highlighting of the inside of his claws. I then water down the white a little bit and just paint it on the inside of his axe where the chaos spear bits are, the symbol there. I paint those inside of his axe with just some watered down white. Then once that's all dry, grab your airbrush, put a little bit of the Vallejo White Ink inside of it, and it's the same principles as we were doing with our armour, but we're just going to be doing that now with a white ink and then applying through the airbrush some fluorescent. So focusing the nozzle into the centre of the circle part, do a few sprays, and you'll get a natural halo from that really intense white fading out into the dark area. And then I kind of try and imagine where that green glowing effect would be pushing out to, so the bottom part of that shoulder pad, down towards the bottom part of his leg, not too far, as it's angled outwards, not inwards. So I just wanted it catching on the bottom areas of his armour. And then the same on his axe. I just make sure that a couple of sprays over the chaos symbols themselves, focusing towards the inside of the axe. Then using some AK fluorescent green into the airbrush with a little drop of water, just a few drops of paint and 1 drop of water. Give it a mix around in the airbrush. I then do some same principles, just airbrush this over all of the white we've just done and a little bit of the surrounding area to get our green glowing effect, or the base of our green glowing effect. If you're a little bit unsteady with the airbrush, you can buy some airbrush putty, and you can put that across the areas of the model that you don't want affected. But I've learned that with a little bit of control, short, sharp, and directions, and a bit of practice, you can easily airbrush without affecting any of the other areas of the model, and you get some nice overspray happening, just to intensify those glowing effects. Okay, back to brushwork, and what we're going to do now is use some intense white from AK, some of the fluorescent green, and then some AK fluorescent yellow. Now with the white, I'm just going to add a few little edge highlights on the areas that would really bounce that light back, which are the sort of metallic areas. So I apply a couple of little dots on any of the metallic areas that are already glowing or reflecting the light. And I add a little bit of white into the center part of that white bit on the circle part of his power claw. I then go over those in the fluorescent green, almost like edge highlighting over an edge highlight with the fluorescent green. And then with the fluorescent yellow, I over edge highlight those as well, focus on the areas I really want to be bright with the fluorescent yellow, especially the inside of the power claw there, that circle part, as that's where I'm imagining would be the hottest and brightest part. And the fluorescent yellow really helps sell the intensity of the fluorescent green. It makes, so with like a fire, you would have yellow is the hottest part, and it's the same sort of with green. The hotter it was getting, the more yellowy, sort of faded out green that you would get, almost going into that yellow. And to finish Huron off, I'm just going to do some simple edge highlighting. I'm using the War Paint Sacred Scarlet, but you can use Cadian, Fleshtone. And all I'm doing is just adding a few highlights here and there on the armour itself, mainly just an edge highlight on the armour with not a pink, but a sort of very fadey, almost desaturated red, just to get some definition around the shapes of the armour. Okay, with Huron done, we're now just going to move on to his little doggo friend. So what I've done is I've just base coated the model in Flayed One Flesh. There's about 3 coats of Flayed One Flesh. I then make another wash of AK Wine Red, and I just paint that all over the dog. You could use Vulpus Pink or Doomfire Magenta, but you just make sure you heavily water it down to get a nice wash consistency. So it's basically getting that paint to pool in all of the crevices and the nooks and crannies to get that definition and shadows. So then what I do is I pick the eyes out in green, because I'm going to have the little green glowing effect coming from his eyes. So I just use the AK Deep Green on his eyes. I then use AK Vampiric Flesh. You could just use the Flayed one Flesh if you wanted to, just a little bit watered down, and then I just paint over the flesh areas, picking out all of the raised areas, the flat edge of the skin, trying to move the brush in the direction that the muscles themselves would be going, but just picking out all of those highlights. I paint the sort of scales and the teeth and little horns and stuff coming from him in the dark black colour. AK Tenebrous Grey I use for those, but any dark black grey for his fangs and claws. The tongue I paint in the blood red, but mainly for the skin, and the scales are in a dark black colour as well. But mainly for the skin, it's washing it in that wine red colour gives it a nice putridy red sore look, and then it's just using a sort of thinned down, brighter skin tone just to bring out those highlights and flatter areas, and try and move the brush in the direction that those muscles are going. Little lines, little striation lines, they help just very slightly bring out some shapes and definition to the areas that are on the little doggo. And then to make his eyes glow, just a little dot of white and a little bit of that fluorescent green, and yeah, the little doggo dude would be finished. Once he's done, I just did some dry brushing of the base. I used the AK Green Brown, AK Mud Brown and AK Light Earth. Just did lots of dry brushing with that. I then put some Dirty Down Rust over the top, slightly watered down so it ran into all the crevices and stuff over the area. And then, as I said, I stuck the dog down on his left hand side below the axe, just so there's something else on that side of the model. It was all a little bit too much over onto his right side, and I wanted the claw to really stand out. And then just on the rim, just did it all in Army Painter's matte black. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. I hope it's easy to follow along. It's given you some ideas for your other Corsairs that you can apply this to. As always, like, comment and subscribe, and happy painting, my fellow painters.